A word of advice: if you ever get assigned to one of the meat assault units of the Russian armed forces and you find yourself staring down a Ukrainian FPV, your best bet is to surrender as quickly and safely as possible. The real surprise isn't that Russians make that decision. The shocker is the latest statistics showing just how many are actually taking the Ukrainians up on their offer to surrender. And even more surprising, who exactly makes up the Russian armed forces, at least the people that survive long enough to turn themselves in. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit subscribe. Let's talk about this one. Okay. So 2025 is over, and the Ukrainian project called the I Want to Live project. This is a single source for Russian military service members to turn themselves in at kind of almost all stages of the fighting. Literally from positions to being assigned to a unit, Ukrainian armed forces work to get those soldiers to surrender. And not only because it deprives the Russian armed forces of a conscript, but also because it gives the Ukrainians a bargaining chip to exchange for their own soldiers. And even more important, it gives them fresh intelligence, right? Even the lowliest conscript is going to know things. For example, how many rounds did you fire in training, or how long was your training, might tell the Ukrainians something about the personnel needs at the front line. What was your enlistment bonus? Would tell them how financially prepared the Russian recruitment pipeline is and how much money is available to draw in new troops. How big was your basic training class? Would tell the Ukrainians potentially how well Russian recruitment is going. And what were the types of people you served with would tell the Ukrainians about the caliber of Russian recruits. And that's just someone who literally surrenders the day they arrive to the front lines. Imagine how much more they would know from a soldier who is a participant in combat operations. And so the Ukrainians, of course, have a tremendous incentive. The Russians, as I would like to point out, have another tremendous incentive to, survive because of the high casualty rate among Russian service members. But the I Want to Live project has dropped a bunch of other really fascinating data. And before we break that down, I wanted to mention that if you want to get an in-depth interview from an actual Russian POW captured in the fighting, well, we have that actually for members on combatvetnews.com. This is my version of Patreon. It is the best way to support the channel, support me, enable me to do this every single day. You can imagine making political content doesn't exactly endear me to sponsors. And so if you guys can become a member, you'll get access to twice weekly combat videos, some of which are videos sent to me from units on the front line that aren't publicly available. And sometimes it's stuff sent to me by units that is. This is actually from the 54th, showing some of their soldiers doing clearing operations in Kupiansk, where they captured a Russian POW. And they have actual video of an interview with him about his experiences that's entirely voluntary, but YouTube would never let me show it to you. But it's a fascinating story. So become a member, click the link in the description, and support the channel. Okay. So here's what I want to point out. The I Want to Live project, right? Here's the offer that they make. They guarantee, if you surrender to Ukrainian armed forces, compliance with the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of POWs, regardless of citizenship or nationality. This is fascinating because the Ukrainians, the Russians do not follow this. And the Geneva Convention actually says that prisoners of war are entitled to at least food rations that are identical to the rations of the members of your armed forces. They're entitled to a certain level of medical care, roughly comparable to those of armed forces, though armed forces of the home country get priority. 3 meals a day, regular medical care, and the Red Cross, of course, facilitating communications with family members. And they also offer the opportunity to apply for asylum in Ukraine or other European countries. That's a huge incentive, by the way, for Russians who are living under a pretty oppressive regime. Of course, they say detention in decent conditions under the supervision of the International Committee for the Red Cross, and voluntary exchange for the servicemen of the Ukrainian armed forces held in captivity, which is also fascinating. These guys can actually volunteer to be sent back to Russia. I actually had assumed up until this point that it was simply a given that if you're captured, Ukraine's going to exchange you. But The fascinating part is, again, you're seeing tens of thousands or over more than 10,000 Russian soldiers who have been taken prisoners since the start of the war. But what's more fascinating is, again, that they're reporting that about 60 to 90 Russian troops surrender every single week. In 2024 alone, the number peaked at 350 in a single week. This is, of course, during the Kursk incursion, when a lot of ill-prepared troops that were in Russia, thinking they were not going to be participants in the fighting, suddenly found that the fighting had come to them. And since June 2023, Russian forces have been captured more frequently than Ukrainian troops, which, of course, is a reversal of earlier trends. And this is fascinating, actually, because remember, Russia is the force on offense. So Russian troops are the ones who have to leave and come to Ukrainian positions. And so the fact that Russian forces are in that situation, actually being captured more frequently, is a testament to just how poor the Russian maneuver scheme is. Because, well, Russian troops should be, if they were really achieving victories, should be isolating and surrounding Ukrainian troops, right? And so the fact that the Russian troops are on offense, but they're the ones who end up surrounded, cut off, or isolated is, well, a sign of just how poor the Russian tactical environment is, or the Russian tactical decision-making. Now, the statistics, the demographics of these guys is actually wild. And again, this is primarily from the I Want to Live project. So they said 7%, that's about 1 in 12 of the captured soldiers were what the Russians call mercenaries. They're not technically mercenaries in most cases. They are foreign fighters serving with the Russian armed forces. Remember, you don't have to be a citizen of a country to serve in their armed forces. A mercenary would be like a contractor, would be one example, like a Blackwater, right? That's someone who is not a member of their home services armed forces. So you have 40 different countries, 2 to 3 new foreign fighters are captured every week. They said 83% were non-rank and file soldiers, i.e. non-leadership soldiers, non-NCOs, non-officers. This makes sense. This is about the breakdown of the Russian armed forces. 13% were non-commissioned officers, and only about 3% were officers. The officers are probably underrepresented in part because they are less likely to serve in direct frontline positions and actually have the opportunity to surrender, but also officers are going to be more politically integrated, right? The Russian armed forces still takes a lot of inspiration from the Soviet armed forces, and in the Soviet armed forces, the loyalty of the officer corps was more important even than their technical skills. The Soviet system would prefer a loyal but ill-trained officer over a capable officer whose loyalty was somewhat in doubt, or whose loyalty had not been proven to the same extent. And so this reflects in the indoctrination. So tiny numbers of officers and a huge number of the average run through the ringer private, right? Someone who is drafted or signed a contract. Well, we'll show exactly what they look like. So 75% were contract soldiers. These are guys recruited in Russian prisons and serving with private military companies. These are the guys who are recruited with these huge bonus enticements. Individuals who go to a recruitment center, sign up on the promise of a massive bonus. Most are between 18 and 65. No shocker there. Mobilized individuals. These are Russian reservists. These are individuals who did their mandatory conscription in Russia, then were kicked back out into the civilian world, and then were activated as part of a mobilization campaign, we'll call it. Officially, sometimes an official, unofficial. So a mobilized individual might have been called up for back in 2022 when Russia needed reinforcements, and it did this mobilization. And then conscripts are just 5% because Russian conscripts can only fight inside of Russian sovereign territory. That 5% represents almost certainly individuals captured in the Kursk incursion. Now, 1 in 4 Russian POWs said they were coerced or misled into signing up for the military. 40%, this is the fascinating part, 40% had criminal records, most commonly for theft, drug offenses, assault, or homicide. This reflects the fact, I mean, I knew that Russia was recruiting criminals, but not to this scale, not to nearly 50%. And you can imagine, though, the actual number might be a little lower in the Russian armed forces, because you have to think that if you are joining the military of the Russian government, well, that government put you in prison. So do you think these people are especially loyal? No. The people with prior criminal records are going to be especially resentful of the Russian government. Only 7% held higher education degrees. That's actually more than I was expecting. Again, that's 1 in 12. And 30% had not completed high school. That's more what I was expecting. Before the war, 40% of these people were unemployed and about half had children. And this is we're piecing together a story here of the typical Russian soldier fighting on the front lines, at least based on this data, right? He is older. He has children. He's chronically unemployed. He has a criminal record, and he is absolutely desperate. And I think that's what leads them to this recruitment center, to say, listen, I'm desperate for money. I have kids. I'm unemployed. I have a record. There's no work for me. And in desperation, they sign a contract with the Russian military. Now, about 50%, over 6,000 Russian POWs have been repatriated to Russia in prisoner exchanges, and most of those exchanges were in 2025. And Ukrainian officials say actually that almost 250 former POWs ended up killed or went missing and were returned to the front lines. This is, again, a very Soviet-era decision because the Soviets would view people who had been too exposed to the West as actually being a problem. This was famous during the Spanish Civil War, where the Soviet Union actually had advisors, military advisors, sent to aid the Spanish Republican side. The problem is that when those military advisors went back to the Soviet Union, this was in like 39, 40, Stalin looked at them as having been corrupted by the West, been exposed to filthy liberalism or whatever he considered Spanish. And so those officers were basically purged almost immediately. So far from having relevant combat experience in the Soviet system, again, loyalty that's questionable must be purged from the system. Loyalty is more important than technical skill. Now, what's also fascinating is that Russia seems to prioritize the return of ethnic Russians. We know this, with short captivity periods and no serious injuries. I think because these guys are, again, short captivity periods, indicating, again, that these individuals have less exposure to the Western ideas relative to someone who spent 2 years in Ukrainian captivity, for example. Someone who spent 2 years in a Ukrainian POW camp, they're going to say, listen, the Ukrainians could have flipped this guy, or he could simply have spent so much time watching TV in a prison that it's the same thing. They're going to come back with some big ideas about democracy or about what the West is really like. And that's a liability. And Russia's not in the business of bringing liabilities into their armed forces. Of course, no serious injuries means they can fight again. Why would Russia want to incur the expense of treating an injury when they can simply get a able-bodied fighter? And they said foreign fighters literally have never been requested for exchange, which is crazy. And so I think, is there a larger story here? Yeah, I do. In talking to some of the units on the front lines themselves, right, particularly in the North, Cardia Brigade, they told me that up to 1 in 10 Russian soldiers who are captured volunteer actually to, well, fight for the Ukrainian side, which is wild in and of itself. And that's not really discussed. There's a public acknowledgement of units like the Freedom of Russia Legion. But I really think the story here is that a little bit like the U.S. in Vietnam, where you pulled out people who were poor, pulled out a lot of like Black Americans, but you brought into the armed forces, you forcibly conscripted people who had a bone to pick with the central government, with the federal government, the United States. And then you ask them to fight and die for the United States. It really just didn't compute for a lot of these guys. And it's a reason why you saw extremely low morale. You saw very little above and beyond kind of stuff. It's a real issue, right? And I think Russia is experiencing the same thing, where because they are recruiting the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, of their society, they're going to draw from people who aren't loyal to their country, who don't love their country, who actually kind of resent it for the raw deal it's given them. And I think that is very, very explanatory. And again, it's fascinating to think so many of them either ask not to be returned, would rather go live in Europe as an asylee, or actually actively fight against the Russian armed forces, which is insane. Again, imagine what it would take to get like me, for example, to be like, hey, I'll switch sides and fight against the American armed forces. It wouldn't be impossible, but it would require something to happen to me in which I fundamentally change the view I hold of the very nature of the conflict or the very nature of the armed forces themselves. Because again, you can disagree. I wasn't exactly a cheerleader for going into Iraq and Afghanistan, but I still believe the U.S. military conducted itself in a generally honorable manner. I would have to see something that would make me reevaluate that. And that's kind of wild. What is going on inside the Russian armed forces? Anyway, guys, thanks to Alfred Chesky, Alan Knutson, Christine Schumann, Dan M., Deborah Oppenheimer, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. You guys make this possible. Thank you so much. Hit subscribe, become a member. I'll see you. Cheers.